Spring 1932. A white mob boss walked into Stephanie St. Clair's Harlem office demanding $10,000 monthly protection money. He had 40 armed men. She had a rotary phone and 3 numbers memorized. What happened in the next 72 hours didn't just humiliate him, it dismantled his entire operation. Spring 1932. The door to Stephanie St. Clair's office swung open without a knock. 3 men walked in like they owned the building. Like they owned Harlem itself. The one in front was Vincent Moretti. They called him Big Vince on the streets, not because of his height but because of who stood behind him. Lucky Luciano's organization. The Italian syndicate that had been carving up New York City like a Christmas turkey, piece by piece, neighborhood by neighborhood. Big Vince wore an expensive wool suit, too heavy for the warm April afternoon. His 2 enforcers flanked him, hands in their coat pockets. The message was clear before anyone spoke. Stephanie sat behind her mahogany desk on the 2nd floor of 409 Edgecombe Avenue, Sugar Hill. The windows behind her framed Harlem rooftops stretching toward the Hudson River. Number slips covered her desk in neat stacks, the paperwork of an empire that grossed $200,000 every month. She didn't stand when they entered. She didn't speak. She folded her hands on the desk and waited. Big Vince smiled. The kind of smile men give when they think the outcome is already decided. "You must be Stephanie," he said. "Not Mississippi St. Clair. Not ma'am. Just Stephanie." Like she was a secretary. Like she was help. "Madame St. Clair," she corrected. Her voice was calm. Measured. The slight Martinique accent still present after 20 years in New York. Big Vince's smile widened. "Right. Madame." He said it like it was funny. Like it was a game. "Listen, sweetheart, I'll make this quick. We know what you're running here. Numbers racket. Good business. Smart business." He pulled out a chair and sat down without being invited. "But see, things are changing in Harlem. New management. You want to keep operating? That's fine. Nobody's stopping you. But there's a cost now." Stephanie's expression didn't change. $10,000 a month, Big Vince continued. "That's the protection fee. Keeps your runners safe. Keeps your parlors from getting robbed. Keeps certain people from asking uncomfortable questions down at the precinct." He leaned back in the chair. "That's fair, don't you think? Considering the alternative." One of the enforcers cracked his knuckles. Stephanie looked at Big Vince for a long moment. Then she looked at the 2 men standing behind him. Then back to Big Vince. "Who sent you?" she asked. It was the first question she'd asked. The only question that mattered. Big Vince's smile faltered for half a second. "That's not really your concern, sweetheart." "It is my concern," Stephanie said, "when someone walks into my office and demands money for protection I don't need." She leaned forward slightly. "So I'll ask again. Who sent you?" Big Vince stood up. The playful tone vanished. "Listen, girl." There it was. "Girl. You don't seem to understand the situation here. This isn't a negotiation. This is a courtesy call. We're being polite. We could have just walked in and taken over. We still can." He placed both hands on her desk, leaning in. $10,000 a month. First payment due next Friday. You got a problem with that? Take it up with someone who cares. Stephanie didn't flinch. Didn't lean back. Didn't blink. She stood slowly, her 5 feet 7 inches frame elegant in a tailored navy dress and pearl necklace. She walked around the desk, not toward Big Vince but toward the door. She opened it. "Thank you for stopping by, Mr. Moretti," she said. Big Vince stared at her. Confused. Insulted. "That's it," he said. "That's your answer?" "I appreciate the information," Stephanie replied. Her tone was polite. Professional. Cold as January. "I'll consider what you've said." Big Vince laughed. Actually laughed. He looked at his 2 enforcers like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Then he walked toward the door, stopping inches from Stephanie. "You got until next Friday," he said quietly. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. We got 40 men in Harlem." "You got what?" "A bunch of number runners and old church ladies." He shook his head. "Think about it, sweetheart." He walked out. His enforcers followed. Stephanie closed the door behind them. She stood there for 10 seconds. Listening to their footsteps fade down the stairwell. Listening to the street noise filter through the window. Listening to her own breathing. Then she walked back to her desk. She didn't sit down. She picked up the telephone. And she started dialing. Vincent Moretti made 3 mistakes that April afternoon in 1932. The first, he assumed Stephanie St. Clair was just another street operator he could intimidate. The second, he thought being a woman made her weak. The third, and most fatal, he had no idea who she actually was. 20 years earlier, 1912, Stephanie St. Clair stepped off a ship at Ellis Island with $10 in her pocket, a single suitcase, and a promise she'd made to herself back in Martinique: never bow. She was 26 years old, Caribbean-born, French-educated, and categorically unwilling to accept the limitations the world tried to place on black women. She'd watched French colonizers in Martinique treat her people like furniture. Watched them grow wealthy off labor they never acknowledged, respect they never earned. She came to America because she believed the myth. Freedom. Opportunity. The American dream. Harlem taught her the truth in less than a month. The jobs available to a black woman in 1912 New York: domestic servant, laundress, factory worker. The pay, barely enough to cover rent in a rat-infested tenement. The respect, non-existent. Stephanie worked as a seamstress for 2 years. Saved every penny. Learned. She saw how Harlem actually worked. Not the Harlem white people imagined, but the real Harlem. The underground economy. The numbers game. The numbers racket was simple, brilliant, and entirely illegal. Players bet on 3-digit numbers, usually tied to stock exchange figures or racetrack results. The odds were 600 to 1. The payout was $600 for every dollar bet. If you won. Most people didn't. But everyone played. Because hope cost a nickel, and hope was the only thing cheaper than rent. By 1920, Stephanie had seen enough. She didn't want to work for someone else's dream. She wanted to build her own. She started small. 5 number runners. 3 betting parlors, policy shops, they called them, hidden in the backs of legitimate businesses. Barbershops. Grocery stores. Laundromats. She ran her operation like a business because that's what it was. She kept meticulous records. Paid her runners fairly, better than anyone else in Harlem. 15% commission. On time. Every week. No exceptions. Word spread fast. Work for Madame St. Clair, you get treated right. By 1925, she had 40 runners. By 1928, she controlled the most profitable numbers operation in Harlem. By 1932, the spring Vincent Moretti walked into her office. She was grossing $200,000 a month. $200,000. In the middle of the Great Depression. While white banks were failing and white men were jumping out of Wall Street windows, Stephanie St. Clair was running an empire. But it wasn't just about money. Stephanie understood something the white mobsters never could. Harlem wasn't just territory to control. It was a community to protect. Every Friday, her runners delivered envelopes to families who couldn't make rent. Not loans. Gifts. No strings attached. Every Sunday, Stephanie sat in the 3rd row of Abyssinian Baptist Church, wearing her best fur coat and her favorite pearl necklace. When the collection plate came around, she donated more than anyone. Not for show. For survival. Hers and theirs. Because in a Harlem where white landlords charged double and white employers paid half, Stephanie's numbers operation wasn't just gambling. It was infrastructure. It was hope with a payout. She employed 300 people directly. She kept twice that many alive indirectly. And everyone knew, you don't cross Madame Queen. You don't cheat her. You don't disrespect her. Because Stephanie St. Clair had something more powerful than guns. She had loyalty. She also had information. Stephanie built networks the way other criminals built arsenals. She had number runners in every neighborhood, every block. They didn't just collect bets. They collected intelligence. Who was moving into Harlem? Who was making threats? Who was taking bribes? Which cops were clean? Which cops were dirty? Which politicians could be bought? Which couldn't? She had contacts in Tammany Hall, the political machine that actually ran New York City. She had relationships with newspaper editors, especially at the New York Amsterdam News, Harlem's black newspaper. She had friendships with Harlem Renaissance intellectuals, writers, artists, activists who respected her mind as much as her money. And she had patience. While men like Dutch Schultz, the white mobster who tried to take over Harlem's numbers racket in 1931, relied on violence and intimidation, Stephanie relied on strategy. She'd fought Dutch for 2 years. Not with Tommy guns. With lawyers. With newspaper exposés. With evidence of police corruption that she'd collected methodically, carefully, and released strategically. Dutch Schultz had more men. More guns. More political connections. But Stephanie St. Clair had been 3 steps ahead the entire time. By spring 1932, Dutch's grip on Harlem was slipping. His reputation was damaged. His costs were skyrocketing. And Stephanie was still standing. That's who Vincent Moretti walked in on that April afternoon. Not some small-time operator he could push around. The woman who'd outmaneuvered Dutch Schultz. Stephanie kept a .32 caliber revolver in her desk drawer. Pearl-handled. She'd never fired it at another person. She didn't need to. The gun wasn't for killing. It was for reminding people she could. But her real weapons were different. 3 telephone lines on her desk. A filing cabinet full of records. A ledger showing every transaction, every runner, every payout. A leather-bound address book with names that would make NYPD captains nervous and Tammany Hall bosses sweat. And an immigrant's understanding that in America, the game wasn't about who was strongest. It was about who was smartest. Who had the most leverage. Who could make the right call at the right moment to the right person. Vincent Moretti thought he was shaking down a woman who ran an illegal lottery. What he'd actually done was walk into the office of a strategic genius who'd spent 20 years building an empire based on intelligence, loyalty, and inevitability. He'd called her sweetheart. He'd called her girl. He'd told her she had a week to pay $10,000. Stephanie St. Clair had fought off the most dangerous white mobster in New York and lived to tell the story. Big Vince Moretti wasn't even in the same league. He just didn't know it yet. After Moretti left her office, Stephanie stood at her window for a full minute. Watching Harlem. Watching the street 3 floors below where black families walked past the Apollo Theater, where number runners made their rounds, where the community she'd built and protected went about their lives. Then she turned back to her desk. She opened her address book. And she started making calls. Not to hired guns. To people who owed her favors. To people who valued information over intimidation. To people who understood that power in New York City wasn't about how many men you had. It was about who you knew. What you knew. And when you used it. Vincent Moretti had given her 1 week. Stephanie St. Clair would only need 72 hours. Monday morning. April 11, 1932. Vincent Moretti didn't wait for Friday. At 6:47 a.m., 2 of Stephanie's number runners, James Quick, Patterson and Samuel Moore, were jumped outside a barbershop on Lenox Avenue. For men. Baseball bats. The message was clear. Work for Madame St. Clair, this is what happens. Quick took a broken rib. Samuel a fractured wrist. By noon, word had spread through Harlem like smoke. Tuesday afternoon, Moretti's crew hit 2 of Stephanie's betting parlors. They walked in during peak hours, when players were lined up placing their bets for the day's number. Overturned tables. Smashed the cash boxes. Grabbed handfuls of number slips and scattered them in the street like confetti. One of the parlors was inside May's Beauty Salon on 139th Street. May Jenkins had run that shop for 15 years. She was 63 years old. She stood in the doorway watching Moretti's men destroy her back room, tears streaming down her face. By Wednesday, 12 of Stephanie's 40 runners had stopped showing up. Not because they didn't respect her. Because they had families. Wives. Children. Mothers who depended on them. And baseball bats don't care about loyalty. Moretti was escalating. Fast. Loud. Making sure everyone in Harlem saw what happened when you didn't pay. Wednesday evening. 7:30 p.m. Stephanie called a meeting. Not at her office. At her apartment. 409 Edgecombe Avenue, 4th floor. The nicest building in Sugar Hill, Harlem's most prestigious neighborhood, where black doctors and lawyers and entertainers lived alongside numbers queens and jazz legends. 16 people showed up. Her most trusted operators. The ones who'd been with her since the beginning. The ones who hadn't run. They sat in her living room. Expensive furniture. Tall windows overlooking Harlem. A gramophone in the corner playing Duke Ellington low enough to talk over. Stephanie stood by the window. Still wearing her navy dress from earlier. Still composed. Still calm. I know what happened this week, she said. I know some of you are scared. I know some of your people aren't coming back. She turned to face them. I'm not going to tell you this is nothing. Vincent Moretti is serious. The people behind him are serious. One of the operators, Marcus Webb, who ran the numbers in the Sugar Hill territory, spoke up. Madam, with respect, maybe we should consider paying. Just until things cool down. $10,000 a month, that's surrender, Stephanie interrupted. Her voice wasn't loud. Didn't need to be. You pay once, you pay forever. You bow once, you stay on your knees. She walked to the center of the room. I didn't come to Harlem 20 years ago to take orders from men like Vincent Moretti, she continued. I didn't build this operation so white mobsters could walk in and take what we earned. What you earned. She looked at each person in the room. Moretti thinks I'm going to fold because I'm a woman. Because I'm black. Because I'm an immigrant. He thinks we're easy. Silence. He's wrong, Stephanie said quietly. Marcus shifted in his seat. So what do? We can't outgun them. Moretti's got 40 men. Luciano's organization behind him. We start shooting, we lose. We don't shoot, Stephanie replied. She walked to her desk in the corner of the room, smaller than her office desk but just as organized. She picked up a leather folder. Thick. Heavy. I've spent the last 3 days making calls, she said. Talking to people. Gathering information. And what I've learned is this. Vincent Moretti is confident. Dangerous. But sloppy. She opened the folder. He's been operating in Harlem for 6 months. Running bootleg liquor out of a warehouse on 142nd Street. Paying off cops in the 135th Street precinct. Shaking down businesses from here to the Bronx. She pulled out a sheet of paper. He thinks he's untouchable because Lucky Luciano's name is attached. But Lucky Luciano isn't watching him closely. And Moretti's been making mistakes. Another operator, Dorothy Harris, one of the only other women in the room, leaned forward. What kind of mistakes? Stephanie smiled. Small. Cold. The kind that matter to people who actually run this city? She explained. Moretti had been moving alcohol shipments without paying proper tribute to Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall wasn't law enforcement, they were the political machine that controlled city contracts, judgeships, police appointments. You operated in New York, you paid Tammany. Everyone knew that. Except apparently Vincent Moretti thought Lucky Luciano's protection meant he could skip the toll. Stephanie had documentation. Shipment records. Delivery schedules. She'd paid one of Moretti's own drivers $200 for copies. The driver hated Moretti, turned out Big Vince liked skimming money from his own crew. Second, Moretti had been extorting black-owned businesses across Harlem. Not just numbers operators. Legitimate businesses. Grocery stores. Restaurants. A funeral home on 125th Street. He'd been collecting insurance payments for 6 months. Stephanie had names. Addresses. Signed statements from shop owners too terrified to go to the police but willing to talk to someone they trusted. Someone who actually protected Harlem. Third, Moretti would be at the Red Rooster Club on Thursday night. 11 p.m. Meeting with a liquor distributor from New Jersey. She knew because the distributor owed her a favor from 1929. Stephanie closed the folder. I'm not going to fight Vincent Moretti with baseball bats, she said. I'm going to fight him with phone calls. Marcus looked skeptical. Phone calls? Phone calls, Stephanie repeated. To people who have more power than Moretti thinks. To people who don't like being disrespected. To people who care more about money and politics than they care about Lucky Luciano's reputation. She sat down in the chair at the head of the room. Moretti thinks this is about muscle, she continued. He's wrong. This is about leverage. Information. Timing. She looked around the room. I've been playing this game for 20 years. I've survived Dutch Schultz. I've survived crooked cops and crooked judges and every white man who thought I'd be easy to break. She leaned forward. Vincent Moretti has been in Harlem for 6 months. He doesn't know this neighborhood. Doesn't know these people. Doesn't know how power actually works here. Her voice dropped. He's about to learn. Dot spoke up. What do you need from us? Keep your runners working, Stephanie said. The ones who are willing. Tell them to be careful but don't stop. I need Moretti to think I'm rattled. I need him confident. She stood. This ends by Saturday. One way or another. After the meeting, after everyone left, Stephanie sat alone in her apartment. She poured herself 2 fingers of French cognac. Sat by the window. Watched the Harlem skyline fade into darkness. She wasn't scared of Vincent Moretti. She was insulted. Insulted that he thought 20 years of strategy, 20 years of building trust and loyalty in networks, could be undone by broken ribs and smashed cash boxes. Insulted that he'd called her girl. Insulted that he'd walked into her office like she was a problem he could solve with threats. Stephanie St. Clair had 3 phone calls to make. 3 people who owed her favors. 3 levers she'd been building for years, waiting for exactly this moment. Tomorrow she'd start pulling them. And Vincent Moretti would learn what it meant to underestimate the numbers queen of Harlem. Thursday morning. April 14, 1932. 9:15 a.m. Stephanie sat at her office desk. 3 telephone lines in front of her. The leather folder open. A cup of black coffee going cold. She'd barely slept. Not from fear. From preparation. The first phone call would be the most delicate. The second would be the most public. The third would be the most dangerous. But together they would dismantle Vincent Moretti piece by piece. She picked up the receiver on the first line. Dialed a number she'd memorized years ago. It rang 3 times. Hines. The voice was gruff. Impatient. James J. Hines didn't like being called before 10. Mr. Hines, Stephanie said. Her voice was smooth. Respectful. It's Stephanie St. Clair. I apologize for the early hour. Pause. Madame St. Clair. Hines' tone shifted slightly. More careful. Jimmy Hines was a Tammany Hall district leader, one of the most powerful political bosses in Manhattan. He controlled judges, police captains, city contracts, and he'd been taking Stephanie's money for 5 years. Not bribes exactly. Donations. To his political club. To his campaign funds. To the machine that kept Tammany running. Stephanie had paid $2,000 a month like clockwork. Never late. Never asking for too much in return. Just access. Protection. The occasional favor. Now she was calling in a debt. What can I do for you? Hines asked. I have a problem, Stephanie said. And I believe it's your problem too. She explained. Calmly. Precisely. Vincent Moretti. Lucky Luciano's lieutenant. Operating a bootleg liquor distribution network out of a warehouse on 142nd Street. Moving shipments through Harlem, through Hines District, without paying proper tribute to Tammany Hall. She didn't need to say the rest. Hines understood immediately. Tammany Hall's power came from control. Everyone paid. Didn't matter if you were Irish mob, Italian mob, or a numbers queen from Martinique. You operated in New York, you paid the political machine. That's how it worked. Vincent Moretti had been skipping the toll. How long has this been going on? Hines asked. His voice was cold now. 6 months, Stephanie replied. I have documentation. Shipment schedules. Warehouse address. Names of the NYPD officers he's paying directly, officers who, I imagine, should be paying you. Silence on the other end. Stephanie waited. Let the insult sink in. Send me everything, Hines finally said. It'll be delivered within the hour, Stephanie replied. And Madame St. Clair? Hines added. I appreciate you bringing this to my attention. Of course, Mr. Hines, Stephanie said. I've always believed in respecting the proper channels. She hung up. One call down. 9:47 a.m. Stephanie picked up the second phone line. This call was different. Not to a politician. To a journalist. She dialed the offices of the New York Amsterdam News, Harlem's most widely read black newspaper. The voice that answered was young. Eager. Amsterdam News editorial desk. This is Stephanie St. Clair, she said. I need to speak with Wilkins. 1 moment, ma'am. 30 seconds later, Madame St. Clair. The voice belonged to Roy Wilkins, assistant editor, sharp writer, and someone who understood that sometimes the most important stories came from uncomfortable sources. To what do I owe the pleasure? I have a story for you, Stephanie said. Front page. Fully documented. And it runs tomorrow. Wilkins paused. I'm listening. Stephanie opened the folder in front of her. Pulled out a stack of papers. Italian mobsters have been extorting black-owned businesses across Harlem for 6 months, she began. Grocery stores. Restaurants. A funeral home. They call it protection money. The victims are too scared to go to police because the police are being paid off. Do you have proof? Wilkins asked. Signed statements from 8 business owners, Stephanie replied. Photographs of the enforcers collecting payments. Names, addresses, dates, amounts. And the name of the man running the operation, Vincent Moretti, lieutenant in Lucky Luciano's organization. She could hear Wilkins writing. Fast. Why are you bringing this to me? He asked. Because the police won't do anything, Stephanie said. Because white newspapers won't care. But Harlem will. And when Harlem reads that Italian gangsters are bleeding black families dry during the Depression, they'll remember who protected them. And who didn't. It was true. Every word. Moretti had been shaking down legitimate businesses. But Stephanie also knew what this story would do. It would make Moretti radioactive. Lucky Luciano didn't mind illegal operations. But public outrage? Front-page newspaper stories about his organization targeting black families? That was bad for business. I'll need to verify the statements, Wilkins said. I'll have everything delivered to your office by noon, Stephanie replied. You'll have time to confirm before tomorrow's print run. This is going to make waves, Wilkins said carefully. Good, Stephanie replied. That's the point. She hung up. 2 calls down. 10:33 a.m. The third call was the most dangerous, because it involved the NYPD. And cops, in Stephanie's experience, were more unpredictable than politicians or journalists. More corruptible. More violent. But also more desperate. She picked up the third phone line. Dialed the 135th Street Precinct. Police headquarters. "Captain William Duffy, please," Stephanie said. "Tell him it's Madame St. Clair." Another pause. Longer this time. Then, put her through. Captain Duffy's voice came on the line. Cautious. Tense. "Madame St. Clair. This is unexpected." William Duffy had been a captain in the 135th Street Precinct for 8 years. He was dirty, took money from bootleggers, numbers operators, anyone willing to pay. Stephanie had paid him $500 a month for years. Not for protection exactly. For discretion. For making sure her operations didn't get raided. For looking the other way. But Stephanie also had insurance. In 1930, she'd hired a private investigator to follow Duffy for 2 weeks. The result? Photographs of Duffy accepting cash from a known bootlegger outside a speakeasy on Lenox Avenue. Clear images. Dated. Documented. She'd never used them. Never needed to. Until now. "Captain Duffy," Stephanie said. Her voice was calm. Almost pleasant. "I'm calling because we have a mutual problem." "Oh." Duffy tried to sound unconcerned. Failed. "Vincent Moretti," Stephanie said. "Italian mob. Been operating in your precinct for 6 months. Shaking down businesses. Running liquor. Paying off some of your officers directly, bypassing you, I imagine." She let that sink in. Duffy was silent. "I don't care about your arrangement with Moretti," Stephanie continued. "What I care about is that he walked into my office 3 days ago and threatened me. Threatened my business. My people. And that's causing noise. Noise that's bad for everyone." "What do you want?" Duffy asked. His voice was flat now. "I want Moretti gone," Stephanie said simply. "Out of Harlem. Out of your precinct. Out of my life. I can't just." "Captain Duffy," Stephanie interrupted. Her tone didn't change. Still calm. Still pleasant. "Do you remember August 1930? Lenox Avenue? The photographs." Silence. "I've kept those photographs in a safe place for 2 years," Stephanie continued. "Never showed them to anyone. Never needed to. Because you and I have always had a respectful arrangement. But if Vincent Moretti is still operating in Harlem by the end of this week, those photographs go to the district attorney's office. And to the Amsterdam News. And to your wife." She paused. "Do we understand each other?" Duffy's breathing was audible over the phone. "Angry. Trapped. Where will he be?" Duffy finally asked. "Tonight. Red Rooster Club. 142nd Street. 11 p.m. He'll be meeting a liquor distributor from New Jersey. Should be easy to catch him with evidence. Shipment records. Good. Maybe even product in his car." "And if I do this?" Duffy asked. "Then our arrangement continues exactly as it has," Stephanie said. "You get your money. I run my business. And those photographs stay exactly where they are." Another long silence. "Fine," Duffy said. Then hung up. Stephanie set the receiver down gently. 3 calls made. 3 levers pulled. She stood and walked to the window. Outside, Harlem moved like it always did. Number runners making their rounds. Shopkeepers opening their doors. Families walking to church for evening service. The Apollo Theater's marquee advertising Duke Ellington tomorrow night. This was her city. Not Vincent Moretti's. Not Lucky Luciano's. Not the NYPD's or Tammany Hall's. Hers. She built it. Protected it. Bled for it. And she would not let some Italian mobster with a big mouth and a small brain take it from her. The calls were made. The pieces were moving. Now came the hardest part. Waiting. By Thursday afternoon, Stephanie's information network confirmed the dominoes were falling. Jimmy Hines had made calls. To Tammany Hall bosses. To Luciano's political contacts. The message was clear. Vincent Moretti had been operating without proper clearance. He disrespected the machine. That couldn't stand. The Amsterdam News was preparing the front page story. Wilkins had confirmed the statements. Verified the names. The headline was already written. Italian mobsters extort Harlem families. Black businesses bled dry while police look away. And Captain Duffy? He'd mobilized a raid team. Thursday night. Red Rooster Club. 11 p.m. Everything was in motion. Stephanie sat in her office as the sun set over Harlem. She poured herself a glass of cognac. Sipped it slowly. She thought about Vincent Moretti. About the way he'd smiled when he walked into her office. The way he'd called her sweetheart. The way he'd assumed she'd fold. Men like Moretti never learned. They thought power came from muscle. From fear. From the number of men you could put on a street corner with baseball bats. But real power? Real power came from knowing who to call. What to say. And when to say it. Stephanie St. Clair had been building that power for 20 years. Vincent Moretti had 72 hours in Harlem. By tomorrow night he'd learn the difference. Thursday, April 14, 1932. 6 a.m. Vincent Moretti woke up feeling confident. In 3 days he'd rattled Stephanie St. Clair's operation. Broken ribs. Smashed parlors. Scared off a dozen runners. By his calculation she'd come crawling by Friday with the first payment. Maybe she'd even beg. He had no idea his world was already burning. 9 a.m. The first fire started at newsstands across Harlem. The New York-Amsterdam news hit the streets like a bomb. Front page. Full spread. Headline in bold letters. Italian mobsters extort Harlem families. Black businesses bled dry while police look away. Below the headline, photographs. Vincent Moretti's enforcers collecting money outside a grocery store on 125th Street. Clear images. Dated. Captioned with names. The article was devastating. Roy Wilkins had written it with surgical precision. 8 business owners named. Their stories detailed. A funeral home director who'd paid $200 a month for 6 months. Money that should have gone to burying Harlem's dead with dignity. A restaurant owner who'd had to lay off 3 workers because Moretti's protection payments ate his profit margin. A 63-year-old grandmother who ran a grocery store and cried when Moretti's men threatened to burn it down. Every story was documented. Verified. Undeniable. And at the center of it all, Vincent Big Vince Moretti, lieutenant in Lucky Luciano's organization. By 10 a.m., every barbershop, church and street corner in Harlem was talking about it. By 11 a.m. the rage was building. Harlem had survived the Depression by protecting its own. Black families helping black families. Community over everything. And now they learned that white mobsters had been bleeding them for 6 months while the police did nothing? The Amsterdam News didn't just report a story. It lit a match. 11:30 a.m. The second fire started at Tammany Hall. Jimmy Hines sat in his office at the Democratic Club on West 58th Street, reading the Amsterdam News article with increasing fury. Not at the content. He already knew about Moretti's extortion. He'd known for 6 months. What enraged him was the public exposure. Tammany Hall's power depended on operating in shadows. Quiet arrangements. Money changing hands behind closed doors. The public couldn't know how the machine actually worked. That cops were bought, judges were controlled, and organized crime paid rent to politicians. Now it was front-page news. And worse, the article made it clear the NYPD had been paid off. Which meant Tammany's carefully managed image of law and order was exposed as a lie. Jimmy Hines picked up his phone. Made 3 calls. The first was to a Tammany boss higher up the chain. The second was to a lawyer who handled sensitive communications with organized crime families. The third was directly to a contact in Lucky Luciano's inner circle. The message in all 3 calls was the same. Vincent Moretti is a liability. Handle it. 1:45 p.m. The third fire started in a brownstone on the Upper East Side. Lucky Luciano sat in a leather chair, smoking a cigar, reading the Amsterdam News article that had been delivered to him by a nervous associate. Lucky didn't get nervous often. He'd built an empire by being smarter, colder, and more strategic than everyone else. But this was a problem. He'd sent Vincent Moretti to Harlem to expand operations quietly. Shake down some numbers operators. Establish territory. Simple. Instead, Moretti had started a public relations disaster. The story wasn't just in the Amsterdam News. By afternoon, it would be picked up by other papers. White papers. The kind that loved writing about Italian gangsters terrorizing Negro neighborhoods. The kind that would bring federal attention. FBI investigations. Grand juries. Lucky Luciano had spent years building political relationships, buying protection, keeping operations quiet. Vincent Moretti had destroyed that in 6 months. Lucky made a phone call. Short. Direct. Pull Moretti out of Harlem. Today. And tell him if I see his face in Manhattan again, he's done. 5:30 p.m. Vincent Moretti was starting to realize something was wrong. He'd spent the afternoon fielding phone calls. Angry calls. From people who shouldn't have been angry. First, a Tammany Hall lawyer he'd never met told him his services were no longer required in Harlem. Then one of Luciano's top men called and told him to shut down operations immediately and report to the Bronx office tomorrow morning. Then, his own crew started asking questions, wondering if they should pull out, wondering if the heat was too much. Moretti tried calling his contacts in the 135th Street precinct, the cops he'd been paying. No one answered. By 6 p.m. Vincent Moretti understood. He'd been cut loose. But he didn't know why. Didn't understand how a newspaper article could unravel everything so fast. He decided to go ahead with his meeting anyway. Red Rooster Club. 11 p.m. The liquor distributor from New Jersey. Maybe he could salvage something. Make some money. Prove he was still valuable. It was the worst decision he ever made. 11 p.m. Red Rooster Club. 142nd Street. Vincent Moretti walked into the club with two enforcers. The distributor was already there, sitting in a back booth looking nervous. They shook hands. Sat down. Started talking terms. The distributor had 3 trucks of Canadian whiskey coming through next week. Premium stuff. Moretti could move it through Harlem, make back some of the money he'd lost this week. 11:14 p.m. The front door of the Red Rooster Club slammed open. 8 NYPD officers poured in. Badges out. Guns drawn. Captain William Duffy led them. Nobody move. Duffy shouted. The club froze. Patrons ducked under tables. The jazz band stopped mid-song. Duffy walked straight to Moretti's booth. Vincent Moretti, Duffy said. You're under arrest for illegal distribution of alcohol, racketeering, and extortion. Moretti's face went white. What the hell are you? Shut up, Duffy interrupted. He nodded to 2 officers. Search him. Search the car outside. They found everything. Shipment records in Moretti's jacket pocket. $4,000 cash. And in his car parked outside, 12 cases of illegal Canadian whiskey, loaded and ready for distribution. Moretti was cuffed. His 2 enforcers were cuffed. The distributor tried to run and got tackled before he reached the door. Captain Duffy stood over Moretti, leaning in close. You should have stayed out of Harlem, Duffy said quietly. Friday, April 15, 1932. 10 a.m. Stephanie St. Clair sat in her office, reading the morning papers. The Amsterdam News had a follow-up story, Police Raid Red Rooster Club, Mobster Vincent Moretti arrested. The Daily News covered it too, Luciano Lieutenant busted in Harlem. Everything had collapsed exactly the way Stephanie knew it would. Moretti arrested. His operation shut down. Lucky Luciano furious and cutting ties. Tammany Hall scrubbing their hands clean. The NYPD making a public show of cracking down on organized crime. All from 3 phone calls. Stephanie set the papers down. 10:47 a.m. There was a knock on her office door. Come in, Stephanie said. The door opened slowly. Vincent Moretti stepped inside. He looked like hell. No sleep. Pale. Shaking slightly. He'd made bail that morning, $10,000, which had cleaned him out. But he wasn't coming to her office to gloat. He was coming to beg. Madame St. Clair, he started. His voice was hoarse. Stephanie stood. Slowly. She walked around her desk and stood 5 feet from him. You walked into my office 4 days ago, Stephanie said. Her voice was calm. Cold. You called me sweetheart. You called me girl. You told me to pay you $10,000 a month. You thought because I'm a woman, because I'm black, because I'm an immigrant, I'd be easy. Moretti opened his mouth. Stephanie raised one hand. He shut up. You had 40 men, Stephanie continued. I had 3 phone calls. You had guns and baseball bats. I had information and patience. She stepped closer. You thought power was about how many people you could hurt. I know power is about who you know, what you know, and when you use it. Moretti looked at the floor. I want you to understand something, Stephanie said. I didn't destroy you with violence. I destroyed you with strategy. I made 1 call to Tammany Hall and you lost political protection. I made 1 call to the Amsterdam News and you lost public credibility. I made 1 call to the NYPD and you lost your freedom. She leaned in. Get out of Harlem, Stephanie said quietly. If I see you again, if I even hear your name in my neighborhood again, the next story in the Amsterdam News won't be about your arrest. It'll be about your funeral. Vincent Moretti nodded. What? Fast. Then he turned and walked out. Stephanie watched him go. She didn't feel victorious. Didn't feel triumphant. She felt tired. And she felt insulted that it had come to this at all. But mostly she felt certain. Certain that Harlem was still hers. Certain that no one, no matter how many men they had, how many guns they carried, how much power they thought they had, no one would take it from her. Not Vincent Moretti. Not Dutch Schultz. Not anyone. She walked back to her desk, picked up the phone, and got back to work. 3 weeks later, Vincent Moretti's name disappeared from Harlem. The charges stuck: illegal alcohol distribution, racketeering, conspiracy. His lawyer negotiated a plea deal: 2 years in Sing Sing, eligible for parole in 18 months. Lucky Luciano's organization paid for the lawyer but made it clear Moretti was on his own after that. No job waiting when he got out. No territory. No crew. He'd been erased. By the time Moretti walked out of prison in 1934, Harlem had forgotten he existed. He moved to New Jersey, took a job managing a warehouse, and never returned to New York City. The man who'd walked into Stephanie St. Clair's office demanding $10,000 a month ended his career loading trucks for $40 a week. But the story didn't end with Vincent Moretti. It spread. Within days, every numbers operator, every bootlegger, every small-time hustler in Harlem knew what had happened. Not just that Moretti got arrested, but how. 3 phone calls. No guns. No violence. Just strategy. The legend grew. They said Stephanie St. Clair had taken down a Luciano lieutenant without firing a shot. They said she'd made the NYPD, Tammany Hall, and the Amsterdam News move like chess pieces. They said she'd destroyed a man with a telephone and a file folder. And the message was clear to anyone who thought about crossing her: don't. Stephanie's operation expanded. By summer 1932, she was running 50 number runners. By fall, 60. Business owners who'd been shaken down by Moretti came back to her, asking for protection. Real protection. The kind that didn't come with threats. She gave it to them. Not for free. Stephanie St. Clair was a businesswoman, not a charity. But fairly. Respectfully. With the understanding that in Harlem loyalty went both ways. She continued doing what she'd always done. Paying her runners 15% commission. Delivering envelopes to families who couldn't make rent. Sitting in the third row of Abyssinian Baptist Church every Sunday, donating generously. Every Friday, Mae Jenkins, the 63-year-old woman whose beauty salon had been destroyed by Moretti's crew, received an envelope with $200 inside. Enough to repair the damage. Enough to keep her business alive. Stephanie never mentioned it. Never asked for thanks. Mae knew who it came from. Everyone did. The Amsterdam News wrote a follow-up editorial 2 months later. The headline, Harlem Protects Its Own, How Community Stood Against Outside Intimidation. It didn't mention Stephanie St. Clair by name. Didn't need to. The editorial praised local leaders, who used intelligence and evidence rather than violence, to push back against organized crime. It called for more community organizing. More documentation of abuse. More pressure on corrupt officials. Roy Wilkins knew exactly who he was writing about. So did every reader in Harlem. But Stephanie's victory came with a cost. The attention was dangerous. The more visible she became, the more threats emerged. Dutch Schultz, who'd been circling Harlem for years, saw the Moretti story as proof that Stephanie was vulnerable. If one Italian mobster could walk into her office and threaten her, why not another? Schultz would make his move in 1933. And Stephanie would fight him for 2 brutal years, using the same tactics she'd used against Moretti. Newspaper exposés. Legal warfare. Public pressure. Evidence of corruption. She'd win that fight too. But it would cost her. Arrest. Court battles. Constant surveillance by the NYPD. By 1935, Dutch Schultz would be dead, murdered by his own associates. And Stephanie would send a telegram to his widow that became famous. As ye sow, so shall ye reap. But in the spring of 1932, after Vincent Moretti disappeared, Stephanie allowed herself one quiet moment of satisfaction. She stood at the window of her office on a Saturday afternoon, watching Harlem move below her. Number runners making their rounds. Families walking to market. Children playing stickball on 139th Street. This was what she'd fought for. Not an empire. Not money. Not fame. Community. The ability for black families to live without terror. To build businesses without being bled dry. To walk their own streets with dignity. Stephanie St. Clair had arrived in Harlem in 1912 with $10 and a refusal to bow. 20 years later, she'd built something no one could take from her. Not with guns. Not with threats. Not with the assumption that a Caribbean woman, black, immigrant, female, could be pushed aside. History would try to erase her. When scholars wrote about Harlem's organized crime, they focused on men. Dutch Schultz. Lucky Luciano. Bumpy Johnson, who, for the record, started his career working for Stephanie before becoming a legend in his own right. They called her a minor figure, a numbers operator, a footnote. But the people who lived in Harlem in the 1930s and 1940s knew different. They knew Madame Queen. They knew the woman who fought the Italian mafia and won. They knew the woman who exposed police corruption through newspaper ads and courtroom battles. They knew the woman who protected Harlem when no one else would. Stephanie St. Clair continued running her numbers empire through the 1940s. She fought legal battles, survived assassination attempts, married and divorced, wrote letters to newspapers calling out racism and corruption in language so sharp it could draw blood. She retired in the 1960s, wealthy and unbroken. She died in 1969, age 83. Her obituary in the New York Times was 4 sentences long. But in Harlem they remembered. They remembered the woman who'd come from Martinique with nothing and built everything. They remembered the woman who'd used intelligence instead of violence, strategy instead of fear. They remembered the woman who'd made powerful men beg for mercy with 3 phone calls and a file folder. Stephanie St. Clair's legacy isn't measured in how many people she hurt. It's measured in how many people she protected. How many families she kept alive during the Depression. How many businesses she shielded from predators. How many times she proved that power doesn't come from muscle. It comes from knowing who to call, what to say, and when to act. Vincent Moretti learned that lesson in 72 hours. History took longer. But eventually it learned too. The numbers queen of Harlem. Madame St. Clair. Queenie. A Caribbean immigrant who refused to bow. A woman who changed the rules. A strategic genius who proved that the most dangerous weapon isn't a gun. It's a mind that sees 10 moves ahead. And the courage to make the call.